Hi guys, my name's Emma Tortolo, and for my book talk today, I'm going to be discussing Reading in the Wild by Donalyn Miller. So, the reason I chose this book is because it was recommended to me by a high school librarian I did field experience with last semester, and she said that anytime she needs to feel inspired again, she picks it up and dips into it. And this is actually the second book. This author is known as the Book Whisperer. Her first book was called The Book Whisperer, and it was all about teaching kids a love of reading. But what she realized after publishing that book was that these students would come through her classes and they would fall in love with reading while they were with her. And then that habit would fall away after they moved on from her class. And at first she blamed it on the other teachers in her school and figured that no one was doing quite as good a job as she was. And finally she realized that teaching kids to love reading is only half of it, and the other more important half is teaching them to be lifelong readers and teaching them to internalize the habit of reading so that even when they're home or on summer break or long after they've moved on to middle school or high school or college, they still think of themselves as a reader and they still choose to read for pleasure. So what she did was she took a survey of tons of her friends and contacts and colleagues, adults and students, who consider themselves readers, and she asked them what their habits were, what their reading habits were. Basically, she was trying to get a sense of what somebody who considers himself a reader is, someone who reads for pleasure. And that's what she means by wild reader, is someone who reads for pleasure. So the 5 habits she came up with are wild readers dedicate time to read, they self-select their reading material, they share books with other readers, they have reading plans, and they show reading preferences. So what she does in this book is each chapter is dedicated to one of those reading habits, and she goes through and explains what that habit means and how to scaffold those habits in your students so that they eventually become internalized. So the first one is wild readers dedicate time to read. She says this is important both in and out of school. We can't tell students that independent reading is important and then not make time for it during the school day. That doesn't send a message that it's important. But she also thinks that you should teach students how to find time to read out of school. And what she found was a lot of students thought, well, I don't ever have a half hour or 20-minute block to read. And so they would just not read at all. And she calls them edge times of the day, sort of 5 minutes while you're waiting for the bus, or 10 minutes stuck in the doctor's waiting room, or 15 minutes stuck at your sister's soccer game. And she says, keep a book with you at all times. She calls it reading emergencies, and that you should always have a book with you for reading emergencies. And she found that by teaching her students to read in these 5 and 7 minute periods whenever they found them in the day, gradually reading became more of a habit. She also is very against homework other than reading. She says, especially in elementary school, there's no research showing that homework has any benefit. And in middle school and high school, it has minimal benefit. And so where possible, she thinks you should encourage teachers in your school to assign independent reading for homework instead of worksheets. The second habit was that students self-select their reading material. And this is a skill set that she thinks you should teach. In other words, you shouldn't always give a child a book to read. You should help them and scaffold them in the process of them selecting a book themselves. You can introduce them to blogs and book awards. Read alouds is a great way to give them a taste of different genres. You can create contests and buzz around new releases, maybe having a raffle to see who gets to read a new release first. And encourage students to use journals so that they can reflect on why they did or didn't like a book. If a student really loved a particular book, find out why he or she loved it. Was it the romance element? Was it the vampires? Was it the historical setting? And once they can really zero in on the qualities they like and don't like in books, it will become easier for them to choose a book and to know what they like. Number 3, I really enjoyed this chapter. It's about how wild readers share their books with others. And what I really like throughout the book is that she's really encourages teaching practices that reflect the way that people interact with books in the real world. She's like, in the real world, who does a crossword or a word search about a book they just read? In the real world, you want to talk to your friends about the book. You want to say, oh my God, you have to read this book. And so that's what she really encourages in her classroom. She gets her students to do informal book talks. and she gets them to sit in small groups and talk about books and pair people up who are enjoying the same book. So she really tries to create a conversation around books. And she introduces her students to Goodreads.com too, which I hadn't realized that younger people use that. I assumed it was a site for old people, but apparently kids like it too. And she said that's a great way to extend their reading community beyond the school year. The fourth reading habit that she mentions is that wild readers have a plan for what they're going to read next. She talks about, her friends she interviewed who all had a stack this high on their nightstand of what they wanted to read next. And so she says that for reluctant readers or beginning readers, getting them interested in a series or even a book by a prolific author, that's a great way to have a natural built-in reading plan. And once readers get that sense of, I've got to read the next one and the next one, they'll get this sense of what it means to have a reading plan. And she suggests that in the reading journals, they also write down names of books they want to read if a friend mentions it or they hear a book talk, and so that they've always got a couple of books lined up that they want to read next. The final habit she mentions is that readers have preferences. So she said, while it's good to challenge students to experiment with different genres, you should also validate their preferences. And if somebody really loves vampire romance set in the 17th century, find those books for them. Let them read what they like, because adults read what they like to read. So, let students read what they like to read too. So while Donalyn Miller, the author, she's a classroom teacher. So a lot of these techniques obviously work best when you have your students all day, but there's, I think, a lot still there that librarians could take from it. And particularly having students involved in book recommendations and getting students to do book talks and write little book reviews and encourage that conversation about books amongst students with peer reviews. And if you want to back up in terms of making any of these changes in your school, in the book, she cites a study that found that reading books outside of school for pleasure, it's the only out-of-school activity that is for 16-year-olds that's linked to getting a managerial or professional job in later life, and also linked to attending college. And there wasn't any single other extracurricular activity, including sports, visiting museums, going to concerts. None of the others had the same connection to those things that reading for pleasure did. And she, in summary, I liked this quote at the end of the book she said, once students have learned these habits, they will feel empowered and capable enough to continue reading away from school. And so here's the book, Reading in the Wild, The Book Whisperer's Guide to Cultivating Lifelong Reading Habits. And it's by Donalyn Miller, who is known as the Book Whisperer. Thank you so much for listening.